Bring a no sleep, you don't feel too bad hours. I'd like to, on behalf of our clients, like to welcome you to this special program. And by way of background, I'm sure most of you have heard of C.S. Lewis's special little book called Mere Christianity. And science has been reading and discussing this book for 2 or 3 months. And, I think it's fair to say we're discovering indeed why this is one of the most beloved Christian books of all time. And it's just a terrific book. And we're so glad to have somebody to talk more about it with us this morning. I'd like to mention, too, that we have 3 more classes in our study. And we meet just down the hall in room 203 if anybody wants to join us for those. And we meet at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. So we'd be delighted to have you join us. And I'm told that I should tell everybody that this presentation is being recorded. And so I think that takes care of that. And now let me call on Mary Hal Poe to introduce our special speaker.
Thank you, Wilson. It is my joy to introduce my dad, Hal.
I did that.
Blame it on him. To introduce my dad, Hal Poe, this morning. As the daughter of a pastor preacher, as a child, I was often the subject. Stories would pop up in his sermons that told tales on me. So I have my notes here. So that time. It's very Christian, but it sure is sweet. My dad is a Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. As I mentioned, he's a Baptist preacher, enjoys doing serving as interim pastors around West Tennessee, and he plays a mean fiddle. But he won the lottery back in 1981 when he married Mary Ann Poe, my mom, from Memphis, Tennessee, and she's also here today. My dad has spent his professional life concerned with helping the church think through how the gospel of Jesus Christ engages culture. And so you see that reflected in some of his class titles that include Harry Potter and the Gospel, Faith and Film, Science and Religion, and for the past 2 decades, a class on C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. He has published 20 books, ranging in topics from evangelism, science and religion, Edgar Allan Poe, a book for which he won the Edgar Award, and most recently a 3-volume biography of C.S. Lewis. And I have memories from my earliest childhood of him staying up until 3 in the morning, typing away on his computer at the dining room table, working on those books. But the only time that he could get work done, my sister and I are having that spent that we were asleep. Lewis and his circle of friends, the Inklings, have been a conversation partner and an inspiration for my dad, especially in terms of how friendship and imagination can engage the broader culture. But on a personal note, my dad has taught me many life lessons. One is always save room for dessert. Always get up in time for breakfast. No matter how late in the day, you have to eat it. And when you make a pecan pie, use corn syrup. But on a more serious note, his example, I want to mention 2 impressions that his example has left with me. And I'll mention them because I see them also in the life and work of C.S. Lewis himself. One is I have repeatedly seen my dad form deep friendships in the most unlikely places. Across political and ideological difference, educational and class background, religion, And I think that is something the world needs more of now. But he also has taught me that the life of faith is more than just believing certain doctrine or following certain rules. It is fertile ground for the imagination and asking questions. That is to say that the life of faith can be an intellectually interesting life. So thank you, Dad, for driving to Greensboro and Mom, and reaching me as well. And thank you all for being here to listen.
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen, I think. You know, the Poes were Presbyterians from the beginning of Presbyterianism until my immediate family, my grandmother was Baptist Adventist, so my immediate family is Baptist, but Mary Ellen has gone back to her roots. And I don't know if you know the primary doctrinal difference between Baptists and Presbyterians, and I was reminded of it this morning. Um, Presbyterians fill up the pews from the front and go to the back. And Baptists fill in from the back and go to the front. That's the big difference. Well, so let's talk about Lewis a little bit. And the the book you're looking at is not really a book. And it began as a series of radio broadcasts during World War II. So he did the first series, and then they invited him back to talk on something else. So he did that series, and then eventually there were 4 different series. Um, and he, let's see. Okay, that's not going forward. That's not going forward. That's not going forward. Okay, come forward. Broadcasting House is the home of the BBC. It was a dangerous time. World War II. Broadcasting House was bombed just a few weeks before Lewis delivered his first series of radio broadcasts. It was a dangerous time for everybody. Um, these are the books that he originally published that in 1954 he combined together in one volume and called it Mere Christianity. But if it's confusing to you in reading through it that he doesn't seem to have one stream of thought that runs through the whole volume, this is why. It's not a book, it's a collection of radio broadcasts. I've got the originals here and thought some of them might be interested just to look at them and see them and hold them in your hands. So I'll let you pass those around, show and tell. Now, those of you who've been doing the series may wonder just how convincing are these books? I mean, if you're a member of the church, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, apologetics doesn't hit you the same way it would if you were an unbeliever or non-believer. So just how convincing is his approach? Anthony Flew was the most famous atheist in Oxford for generations. He wrote a philosophy of religion textbook that was used for over 50 years and went from one edition to the next. And he was a student of Lewis. He knew Lewis back in the 40s when he was an undergraduate. And he was never convinced by Lewis's approach. Lewis never thought the approach of the idea that the universe seems to have a design to it. He was never interested in that approach. But here about 2000, 2001, Anthony Flew suddenly wrote a letter to his philosophy guild. It appeared in his journal, and it was about some subject. And in a PS, he said, "By the way, in the next edition of my philosophy of religion, I take the position that God exists. And he was convinced by the design argument. So different people are asking different questions. And you can give them the answer to one question, but if that's not the question they're asking, it just has no impact at all. And for those of us who are in conversation with people who are asking questions, it's important to listen to the question they're asking rather than try to impose upon them an answer to another question. Now, as for, let me give you two people who were convinced by this argument of Lewis. One is Lewis himself. This morning, what I'd like to propose to you is that mere Christianity, or we'll focus on the first section, the first two sections, really, is not a well-conceived argument for the existence of God. It's not a philosophical argument. In fact, it is Lewis's testimony of the steps in his own conversion, how he was asking himself deep questions, and slowly over a period of 15 years, finding the answers. Now, the other person I want to point out is a reprobate who was in the Nixon White House in charge of dirty tricks, a totally amoral man named Chuck Colson, who got caught not over Watergate, but breaking into the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg, who some of y'all are of a certain age that you remember the Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg was the one who leaked those. And Colson went to jail for being involved in breaking into that office. While he was in jail, he read Mere Christianity. And he was converted. He became a different person. He was repentant. He was confessional. He took responsibility for what he'd done wrong, and he devoted the rest of his life to helping men in prison and prison reform, that sort of thing. So for people asking certain questions, mere Christianity is helpful. Now, what about Lewis? What's his background? He was raised in the Church of Ireland. His grandfather was the rector of their church. His grandfather baptized him at St. Mark's Church. And he was the Church of Ireland is the corollary to the Church of England. That is, it's the state church, just as you've got the Church of Scotland. And so when Lewis moved to England, remember, he wasn't English, he was Irish. Always thought of himself as Irish. He moved into the Church of England there. The big issue in Lewis's childhood was that his mother died of cancer when he was 9 years old. And like most people, and I would say probably everyone in this room at some time or another has asked the big question. If there's a good, loving, all-powerful God, why do bad things happen? And it's usually more specific. For Lewis, why did my mother die? It's the same question that Charles Darwin was asking. In his case, it was, why did my daughter die? It was the same question Edgar Allan Poe was asking. Why did my wife, my mother, my father, everybody I ever knew die? It's a legitimate question. It's one of the oldest questions in the world. Most Old Testament scholars today, whether you're liberal, conservative, fundamentalist, atheist, are taking the view that the book of Job is probably the oldest written part of the Old Testament. There's oral tradition that precedes Job, but Job is probably the oldest written book in the Bible. And that's the big question. Why is this happening to me? As we look for some purpose. So it's the first big thing that at 9 years old, Lewis began thinking, well, maybe there's not a God. Then the next big thing that happened in school, he was shipped off to boarding school and had a terrible experience in all of his boarding schools. But studying Latin, how many of you studied Latin in school? Oh, yes. Amo, amaria, maria, matis, do, dari, dedi, datus, gricoli, feminine. Yes, we did that. But in learning Latin and the mythologies of the Romans and the Greeks, he was told by his teacher, now all of these mythologies are just made up stories that the ancients made up to explain natural phenomenon and to explain the forces of nature and that sort of thing. And Lewis, as a precocious young adolescent, took it the next step. Well, if all the Greek stories of gods are just made up, then the Bible's just made up too. And that was reinforced for him in his last educational experience before going off to Oxford. He had such a dreadful experience in boarding school. His father took him out and placed him with his own headmaster, who was now retired, who took one student a year to board with him, live with him at his home, and was tutored privately. And Lewis thrived in this situation. He was brilliant, and he now was in a situation in which he could thrive. But what Mr. Lewis did not realize from the time during that period in which he had now school and Kirkpatrick had gone down a different path intellectually, Kirkpatrick was now no longer a confirmed Presbyterian. He was now a confirmed atheist and a materialist by conviction. So for our purposes this morning, we'll think of materialism as that philosophical perspective that only the physical universe of energy and matter exists as revealed by our senses. So the only thing that exists is the physical world of matter and energy, atoms, subatomic particles, the four fundamental forces. And the only way you know it's there is through your senses. There are no non-physical qualities or values. These are meaningless terms because they do not refer to actual objects that can be known through the senses. In that situation, nothing is good or evil. Those are non-physical qualities. Nothing is beautiful or ugly. Nothing is right or wrong. Things just and yet, for the materialist, abstract thought or reason, rationality is valid. And so what Einstein did was not empirical science through his senses. He did it all through his mind, calculating. So rationality, reason. Then in that context, and through Kirkpatrick's teaching, used a history book that gave a scientific interpretation of English history. And so all of these philosophical ideas were coming into his educational experience. So when he was doing history, he was doing philosophy. When he was doing English, he was doing philosophy. When he was doing math, he was doing philosophy and didn't know it. So the history of religion school, also related to comparative religion and phenomenology of religion, gave Lewis perspective that, first of all, primitive humans associated the power of nature as spirits. That was the first stage of the development of religion. Secondly, after some time, spirits became aggrandized and anthropomorphized as gods. So these weren't impersonal forces like the Star Wars Force. They were beings like Zeus. And then the gods became good and refined, dignified gods. So that's what's going on with his atheism. Um, and in the mornings, working with Kirkpatrick, his mind was assuming a highly rationalistic attitude that really protected his atheism that had come to him emotion. And that's often the situation. Our emotions will lead us to a perspective, and then we rationalize our perspective. This is a common thing for all of us. But in the evenings, he had time for pleasure reading. And in the 2 years that he was with Kirkpatrick, he read around 200 books, many of which he read 3 and 4 times. And this was his pleasure reading. He loved the novels of Jane Austen, of the Bronte sisters. And in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he makes the comment, a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. And he loved these stories. He loved the stories. He loved the values that were embedded in them. And any of you like Jane Austen? You know, a few years ago there was a all range of making movies out of Jane Austen stories, and she's enjoyed a renaissance. Well, he loved these stories. Then he started. The other thing he loved was Norse mythology, and he followed Norse mythology. Did a lot of reading in that. Of course, these are dark tales. In Norse mythology, there are no happy endings. There's a longing for something, and nothing ever works out. But one of the great tellers of Norse mythology was William Morris, who was really big in the late 1800s. And Lewis started reading anything Morris wrote. One of the stories was The Well at the World's End. Now, here's the plot. The hero goes off on a quest for the great thing, and you give up everything in order to go on the quest. And you sacrifice everything you have, everything you are, in order to pursue this great quest to the end of the world. And along the way, you fight all sorts of foes, and you rescue the damsel in distress. And once you get to the great thing that you've given up everything for, you've found it, and then you return home a different person. That is, in the course of the journey itself, you are changed. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe. That song from the Man of La Mancha is, in fact, the plot line to this type of story. And Lewis discovered that it's a story that was popular in the Middle Ages and that was told over and over again. Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur contains the story of the quest of the Holy Grail. And Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen retells the same story. The Faerie Queen was the last great poetic allegory of the medieval period. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare dealt more with realism, down to earth, the world as we know it. And so there's this division. You can say this is the beginning of the modern world. You can say all sorts of things at the beginning of the modern world, but that's where he was. Then he found another more contemporary writer, George MacDonald, a 19th century Scottish writer, wrote a little book called Phantastes. And it's the same plot. In search of something. Lewis fell in love with this plot And it's the story of there and back again. Have any of you ever read The Hobbit? The subtitle of The Hobbit is There and Back Again. I argue in the biography that Tolkien got that plot from Lewis. Don't have time to explain that now. But anyway, I'll just throw that idea out for you. Um, and so there were all of these values uh, connected with these stories. And Lewis said at this time in his life, everything that he thought was real was dry and dusty and just bleak. And everything that he thought was imaginary was glorious and wonderful and bright. So you've got some what we now call cognitive dissonance. We've got this tug going on inside it. And in the end, he was forced to admit that values are real and that they must have their origin beyond matter and energy. And when I say he was forced to believe it, he spent the first 5 years of his academic life trying to prove they were not real. He wrote lectures, he wrote essays, and he called it the Promethean fallacy. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was the one who gave fire to humans. And so he said the Promethean fallacy is thinking that our values have come from somewhere outside of time and space, something eternal that come into us, a gift from the gods. That's the Promethean fallacy. And he finally had to admit there is something besides matter, but certainly not personal God, not this aggrandized God. Now, that is essentially the first section of Mere Christianity. And he named that first series of broadcast talks Right and Wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And he left it there because he'd just been asked to do one series of talks. And so he just puts that idea out there for people to think about. And notice, those of you who've been reading the book, he's not really arguing. It's not debate. He's suggesting ideas. He's in conversation with his audience, which I think is an important thing for those of us in conversation with non-believers. Evangelism and apologetics are not an argument or a debate. They're conversation. And the purpose of apologetics isn't to win an argument. It's to clear away misunderstandings and to help answer questions. And you can win the argument, only you really haven't won it. And I think this is something that's happened with apologetics the last 50 years. It's been seen as a great war with atheism or materialism, when effective apologetics for the last 2,000 years has been the conversation answering questions. And that's what Lewis was good at, these conversations. Now, he did have arguments with his best friend. His best friend was Owen Barfield. Barfield was an anthroposophist. Anthroposophy was a mix of, it's still around. It's a mix of some religious ideas, philosophical ideas. It borrows a little bit here and there from different religious traditions. Borrows heavily from the Jesus story and the idea that Jesus was a great teacher. So those of you who've read Mere Christianity know that the end of the second series of lectures ends with this question of how do we regard Jesus? Can we see him as just a great teacher when he made certain claims about himself? He he always, people would say, are you the Messiah? And he said, well, don't call me the Messiah, call me the Son of Man. Now, our 21st century ears, Son of Man means you're human, you're Son of Man. But first century ears who were familiar with the prophecies, specifically of Daniel, Daniel 7, one like a son of man, at the last judgment, suddenly appears in the presence of God. He has the glory of God, the sovereignty of God, receives the worship of God, and rules the everlasting kingdom of God. And so the rabbi said, he's God in human form who will stand at the last day as the judge. And so when Jesus was calling him, and notice in the Gospels, he's always insisting, I'm the Son of Man. And that's what he insisted at his trial. I'm the Son of Man. So Jesus made some pretty exalted claims about himself. And Lewis says, people who make claims like that can be regarded as a madman, or they can be regarded as a demon, or maybe they're telling the truth, in which case they're the Lord of glory. And you've got to decide which of those three fits with Jesus. And it's not a dogmatic argument. Do you notice that? It's suggestive, but it's not dogmatic. It's the sort of thing you have to think about. You have to ponder. Well, Lewis didn't come up with that argument himself. I'll get to that in a moment, but first, I'm running away from the anthroposophist. Lewis, like so many people in the modern world, um, and like Toad of Toad Hall. Did any of y'all read Wind in the Willows? Toad is always after the latest thing. This is the real thing. And, you know, it was a motor car, and then it was a motorboat, and then it was an airplane, the real thing. And it's the latest thing. And there are one or two baby boomers in here who will remember hula hoops from about 1958, hula hoops. And the baby boom generation has always uh, followed the latest thing until we get to these things. And then at a certain point, the baby boom generation is tired of the latest thing. Please don't do anything else. Well, in terms of ideas, and Lewis's friend Barfield convinced him that just because something is old does not mean it's wrong. And just because there's a certain new fad, intellectually or technologically, doesn't mean it's good. And he referred to this as chronological snobbery, the idea that a new idea is a good idea, an old idea is a bad idea. And this struck Lewis, who was studying medieval allegorical courtly poetry, that maybe some of the old ideas were in fact good ideas. They may be out of fashion, but they're not wrong. So that was the first big thing. And then the second big thing was materialism is inconsistent in its view of rational thought. That if nothing exists except physical world, and we're products of the physical world, thus we're part of the physical world, and the physical world is non-rational. It just is. Then what makes us think our rational thought is valid and reliable? And a quick picture of this we can all grasp. Our rational thought interprets our sense experience. So we see the sun rise in the morning, we see it go across the sky, we see it go down in the evening. Therefore, our rational mind concludes that the sun goes around the earth. Logical, irrefutable proof. And so Lewis is shaken with that idea that there's must be something else going on. And he concluded that the human mind has a relationship to the universe, and that the universe is itself mental in some way. And here he doesn't mean the moon is mental and the sun's mental. He means there's something behind the universe that is mental, that is intelligent. That our logic was participation in a cosmic logos. This isn't yet biblical faith, it's not yet Christianity, but it's a long, long way from atheism. It's the conviction there's somebody out there. And those of you who've read Mere Christianity, all these ideas, I hope, are popping up in your mind where you remember, oh, that's what he was talking about in this section. And remember the problem of pain, problem of suffering, also called the problem of evil. $5 word is theodicy. The problem with the problem of evil is that we cannot ask the question unless good and evil exists. You cannot ask, how can a good God let bad things happen unless there's such a thing as good and bad? That question is not possible apart from the existence of these values. And if the universe is red with tooth and claw, y'all know that phrase, it's one of the old romantic poets. How did we ever come up with the idea of a good God? And so Lewis concludes there's something making itself known to us in spite of our experience. Contrary to our experience, there's something making itself known to us. And so now that he's in his mid-20s, he's reading G.K. Chesterton. He liked Chesterton. He thought Chesterton was clever. Chesterton was not a theologian. He was just a very clever man, thought deep thoughts, but did it in a clever, entertaining way, had a big following. And Chesterton had a different way of looking at the history of religion. He did see development. Well, if you go through the Bible, you see development too. Abraham didn't have any laws, did he? Except there was one rule Abraham was given: don't make a sacrifice on an altar of cut stone. Just pile up some rocks. That is it. No priest. And so Chesterton took the view that religion has a supernatural history to it. That yes, there's something going on with humans. You know a whole lot more than Jeremiah did. Jeremiah knew a whole lot more than Abraham. While it may have three stages, they're not evolutionary. That is, one does not necessarily lead to the next. A radical leap is involved from one to the next, which requires something that might be called revelation. Now, I've been intrigued that Lewis will use these same ideas in a lot of his writing. The year before he did the radio broadcast, he published a little book called The Problem of Pain. And in it, he discusses many of the same things, but he does it in different order. And he's not proving the existence of God. He's saying, given that there is a good, loving, all-powerful God, what do we make of suffering in the world? But he was dealing with these ideas over and over again because they were the ideas that had led to his own conversion. And so Chesterton is the one who first proposed for Lewis this idea that Jesus is either a madman, a devil, or the Lord of glory. And finally, we're going to end on time, Mary Ellen. Think of that. One more thing about his personal experience. Remember, mythology had been one of the reasons he gave up on God and the Bible, that it's just made up stories. Now, he loved mythology. He loved especially Norse mythology. But he took up with some Christians once he was teaching at Oxford. He was shocked, horrified, dismayed to find that the cleverest people in the English faculty were all Christians. And it just didn't make any sense, but hey, live and let live. They can be Christians. One of them was Ronald Tolkien. The other one was Hugo Dyson. Here's a picture of them sitting together in 1954, the year that The Lord of the Rings was published. But Lewis invited them to dinner at Magdalen College just before the start of the fall term in 1930. And supper just takes forever in Oxford. The number of courses, and then after supper, you go into what we call the faculty lounge, what they call the senior commons room. And there they have coffee and their port, and they'll talk for another hour and a half. And so late at night, Lewis and his friends went walking there on the grounds of Magdalen College. And conversation got around to mythology and religion. And Lewis said, I love the story of the dying and rising God anywhere I find it except the Gospels. And he said, it's the same old story you find in virtually every culture of the dying and rising God. And in the course of the conversation, he tells us in Surprised by Joy and a few other places in some of his letters to his friends. What he came to see was that the only real difference between the story of Jesus and the story of all of these mythological dying and rising gods is it was the myth that actually happened. And that understanding answered a big question for Lewis as a literary scholar. Why in the world do you find the same story peppered all over the planet? Well, I'm going to leave you with a challenge. Mere Christianity is not a well-crafted, calculated argument. It's the story of one man's conversion, and he tells it in the third person. It's his testimony. Just before he ascended into heaven, Jesus told his disciples, "You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you shall be my witnesses, beginning in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world." Every one of us has a story. It's not necessarily a story of our conversion. It might be a story of how we got through a difficult time in life. It might be a story of how we were so aware of the presence of Christ and the grace of God at a critical moment. It's those critical moments in life that we remember almost as though they just happened a few moments ago. We've all got a story. And that story will help some people answer some questions they're dealing with. And I would just challenge you to be willing to tell your story when the moment arises. Great thing about evangelism and sharing our faith is the Holy Spirit does all the heavy lifting. You don't have to create an opportunity for it to happen. The Holy Spirit creates the opportunity. And if you're willing to tell your story, that moment will happen And you don't have to win an argument. You don't have to persuade anybody. Jesus doesn't expect you to, because that's what the Holy Spirit does. Takes all the pressure off us. So be a joyful witness. And thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure being here. And I think we're dismissed.
Great job.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Or back into that. So it's. Part of the